What's up YouTube? We're back at it again to finish wiring up our Super Beetle project. And before we get into the video, I have a task for everyone viewing right now. I have two questions for you that I want you to leave answers to in the comments below. My first question is, what should we be naming the Super Beetle project? Right now it doesn't have a name, and I feel like it's almost a crime to go to our first start without it having a name. So please give me your opinion. My second question is, are you guys interested in merchandise? My amazing fiance actually went ahead and made me a Ratchet Motors shirt. It's the only one we have right now, but I'm putting out a feeler right now to see if any of you are interested in purchasing some merchandise. It could be a shirt like this, or you can give us your opinion. Maybe it's a bigger logo, maybe it's a logo on the back. This was just our prototype. We only had one, so please let us know what you think so we can understand if you guys are interested in purchasing merchandise and what exactly you guys would like to purchase. The advantage of having merchandise available is it gives everyone an opportunity to support Ratchet Motors, not only giving us money for better projects and potentially better equipment for our content, as far as recording equipment and editing equipment, but it also provides everyone a chance to support us by just showing off that you like Ratchet Motors, you like what we're doing. Please let us know what you think in the comments and let's get right into the video. And also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now because we are going to be having a lot of great content coming out this summer, especially with the Super Beetle project getting very close to starting. And as I mentioned before, we do have a 1,000 subscriber project that we have in the works right now, and we're just waiting for a few final pieces to get put together before we start making content around that as well. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be finishing the wiring for our Super Beetle project, and we have quite a few small, slightly easier tasks to complete before we can put everything in the car and flash our tune onto the computer and hopefully hear that first start. So I put a list together because I feel like when I'm getting close to the end of any project, and sometimes it can be overwhelming with all the little tasks, it's always best to just kind of put a list down so you can just mark it down one by one. So the big things that we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be creating a relay panel. I haven't created it yet, but it's going to be something like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a relay for the fuel system, a relay for the ECU. I have a starter relay already in the car that I'm going to mount to this panel for just kind of cleanliness. And then we're going to add two relays, one for each of the radiator fans so that we can control them based on each fan based on temperature. In addition to that, we're going to be finishing the wiring for the intake air temperature sensor and mounting that into the top mount intercooler. And before we get into filming anything, I'm actually going to change out of this shirt because it's the only one we have right now and I really like it. But please leave a comment below and let me know if you guys are interested in buying it too. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mount our GM intake air temperature sensor into our intercooler. This is flipped over, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill and tap a hole right in the bottom of it and thread it in. And it should be pretty straightforward. So I'll show you guys once I have it tapped in there. So here's our sensor installed. I know when I originally said I was going to do it from the bottom, but after having the intercooler in the car, it really just made sense to put it right in the top. I can wire it here where I'm going to have all my throttle position sensor and my, my idle air control valve. All that wiring is going to end up right here with it. So it's actually a perfect location. So now we'll finish the wiring here on the engine harness. We'll get it in here and just get it the right measurement for the length. And then we'll be done everything on the engine harness besides repinning our bulkhead connector to the Deutsch connectors, which we'll do in parallel when we do our our ECU wiring harness. Alright, so now that we know exactly what length we want it, I took the connector, or I guess the plug, off of the intake air temperature sensor, and I'm going to connect it to our engine harness right here where I left my wires originally. Finish wrapping this all up, and then we're pretty much done with the engine harness, again with the exception of the bulkhead connectors, which should be pretty much a plug and play at that point. So real quick, I'm just going to splice this in, wrap it up, and be done with this. We'll move on to something else. Alright, so we're also going to try some new tape I got. This is rated up to like 300 degrees Fahrenheit. It's specifically made for like engine looms and stuff like that. The guys from Haltech actually suggested it. So we're going to give it a shot. Ooh. Do not use your teeth to try to cut it. But yeah, 300F means that you could actually put this on pretty much any part of the car and it should be fine. Which is really nice because tape tends to melt or become less adhesive when it gets that hot. Alright, I was just double checking here to make sure that the polarity didn't matter for the sensor, and it doesn't look like it does. So we'll crimp it together and it'll be all set. Alright, so now we're going to move on to all the relays that we need to use. And so we're going to need 5 total, one for the starter, one for each of the radiator fans, one for the ECU, and one for the fuel system. So what I'm going to do is I actually bought this plastic, I think it's ABS, a while ago, and I used it to do the same thing for my, basically a relay panel, fuse panel that I had made for my dash, and I'll show you guys that in a few minutes. But what we're going to do is actually use this piece of plastic to mount all the relays as well as our fuse block, and this will just make it a lot easier to keep everything kind of clean and organized, and also be able to move it in and out of the car, and at some point finally mount it without having, you know, components everywhere, wires everywhere. So the first thing we're going to do is get all these things kind of roughed in and where we want them mounted, and then we'll start going through the actual wiring. Alright, so now that we have all the relays mounted, we're going to mount the fuse block in pretty much the exact same fashion, and then we can get to actually wiring this up. Alright, so we're going to start by crimping in all of our 30 pin on the relays, which is the power. It's the 12 volt power, and this will be essentially the power that runs to whatever component that you're wiring in. Alright, so you can see we have all the power and the fuses wired up now. There we go. And so you can see I have only 4 fuses and 5 relays. The reason is this 5th relay already has a fuse that's kind of off the board, so we're just going to keep with that. We'll wire that in at the end because it's mounted in the car. Alright, so we're actually going to start by running some of these wires in the car that we need. So right here I have the 3 wires for the fuel pump and each of the radiator fans, and we're going to run these from where the ECU will be in the car, which is somewhere back here, all the way up the door sill and into the frunk. And we don't have the fans there yet, but we're going to make a shroud for them, and we know at least where the wires will go, and you can see our pump is right there, so we'll run the wires up here so we have those lengths, and then we'll be able to terminate them at the actual relay panel. So now you can see what I did was I just added some braiding to this wiring and ran it all the way up here to where we're going to have our radiator fans, and this is where our fuel pump is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to terminate these so that I can connect to the radiator fans and the fuel pump, and then I'll create one common ground for all of them and kind of string it together, ground it somewhere on the body, and then we'll be done with everything in the front of the car so we can move back to where the the ECU is going to be mounted. I'm just showing a little bit of progress here. You see those 2 wires will be for one fan, those 2 will be for another. We'll get them in that loom, and we have the wire right there that will pop out for the power for the fuel pump, and we'll do a common ground all right above that in the metal right there. Alright, so time for another update. You can see what we've done here is we've added 2 connectors, one for each radiator fan, and these will be driven off of 2 free injector outputs that we have on the ECU. And additionally, we have the fuel pump wired in, and you can see right here, this is where all of our grounds from the fuel pump and both radiator fans are going to mount to the body to have a body ground. And so that completes everything we need to do up front for the wiring. As you can see, I also have the fans up here with the matching radiator, with the matching plugs that I put on those down here. And so I'm still debating if I'm even going to mount these for now or not. For our first startup, it's not really necessary. And I want to add a shroud to the radiator really to get the most efficiency out of our fans. But for now, as far as wiring, we are done up front. So all we have left to do is wire in our ECU and our relay panel in the car. Alright, so now we're back to working on the ECU harness, and what we're going to start with is actually pulling out any of the wires that aren't going to go to the engine bay, which is mostly the battery grounds, and also it appears that just a couple of the outputs basically to our dash, which would be our tach output, and we'll splice our oil pressure output as well, just so we have all those at the dash. And actually, I'm not even positive. Yeah, okay. So we're going to start with our white connector on the MS3, and what that has actually only a few. We're going to start with the gray connector because that has most of the battery grounds that we're going to want to pull out. So this is kind of how I'm going to have it set up in the car. I have the ECU, the relay board, and then my battery will be over here on the other side, on the passenger side of the car. So we'll pull out the battery grounds and kind of just get a rough routing of where we want them to go. And then from there we'll actually start pinning in based on the pinout that we made on our previous video. You can see pinout for the gray and the white connector. Yeah, and we're just going to dig into it. Alright, so fortunately with the gray connector harness, because there's 2, a white and a gray on the ECU, anything that is a black wire is a ground, so we can actually pull those out without really having to pin too much. I will double check that at the connector. It was a first pass, I'm just going to yank them all out and hope for the best. Alright, so we went through the gray connector and pulled out all the grounds. So that's really all we're going to do with this for now. There are quite a few wires. You can see in my list, there's quite a few NAs, which are non-applicable for me. But what we'll do is we'll pull those out at the end. We'll wrap them up and kind of keep them separate. I don't want to cut them out because chances are we may use them in the future, whether we add something like meth injection or extra inputs or anything like that. So we're just going to kind of neatly pack them away separately from the main harness that will go to the bulkhead connector. But that's everything we need to pull out for the gray connector. So now what we're going to do is the same thing for the white connector, which are quite fewer grounds there. And then from that point we'll start actually wiring into our relays. And then the final step will be to wire our bulkhead connectors with our engine harness. And now for the white connector, it's really not as easy as just pulling out anything that's a black wire, because we have a lot of different ones in here between our negative for our crank sensor and quite a few other ones. So we're going to actually use our connector and our multimeter to pin out and figure out exactly what wire, just make sure we're pulling the right things out. But for this, we're actually going to pull out not only the battery grounds, but we'll also pull out the 2 injector pins that we're going to use to activate our radiator fans, as well as we will need to pull out one for our fuel pump relay and our ECU relay. So it's going to be quite a few more wires getting pulled out of this harness that's going to be used directly in this vicinity. So we don't need those to go all the way to the engine bay in our application. Unfortunately, these actually all have labels on them too, but I'm just trying to do my due diligence. I don't expect that Amplify or DIY Auto-Tune has these wires mislabeled by any means, but it's always good to double check your work and double check your diagrams and harnesses and everything, because you never know. Particularly, this is from my experience with working on Subarus in the past, where you see a diagram that has one wire color and that's not actually accurate when you are going through the steps. What you see on the diagram may not actually match reality. And that happens more so in actual manufacturing environments. Between model years they change, or potentially documentation hasn't been updated. Between wire harness changes, it could be a quick revision, yada yada yada. But that's why we just make sure we know exactly what each pin is doing, regardless of what the label is on it. Alright, so now you can see, just like the connector, the gray connector harness, we've pulled out everything that's going to go either to the relay panel or to the battery, or actually in the case of the TAC output, right to the gauge cluster. Now the only thing I'm having a hard time figuring out is there is a pin for power ground and pin for logic ground, and in the manual it notes that both these need to go to the battery to make sure your signals are clear, and I imagine the power ground just for the power of the actual ECU. But I'm not able to track those down in the harness. There is one wire that appears to match it, but I'm not getting continuity. So to be honest, I'm a little confused. I'm going to have to reach out to Matt at DIY Auto-Tune. He's been really helpful throughout all this, and get that squared away. But we can still move forward with connectorizing everything to our relay board, and also beginning our bulkhead harness. I just don't want to get too far into the bulkhead harnesses without knowing exactly what the power ground and the logic ground do. I mean, I know that the power ground, it says it connects to all the shields for the sensors, so that's pretty straightforward, but I can't actually figure out where I need to splice in to bring that to the battery, or if I'm misunderstanding what the schematic is actually requesting. But like I said, we can still move forward with the knowns that we have between the gray connector and the white connector. And once we have the relay panel wired up and the majority of this done with the bulkhead connector, that's probably where we'll end the video. And our next video will contain finishing up the harness, adding our vacuum lines, and our first start. So that's really good news. We are making really good progress, but there are still just a few unknowns that are going to keep us from getting the first start on this video. The next thing we're going to do is kind of just connectorize things between the relay panel and our universal harness for the ECU. And the reason I'm doing this is just so that it can be somewhat removable if I ever need to take the harness out or take the relay panel out. I kind of don't want to have everything be solid connections. Alright, so just tuning in for another quick update. We kind of been jumping around. I didn't film everything because it's just honestly probably a little boring for people to watch. But what we have now is we have one connector pinned in for our both of our radiator fans, basically for our relays. We have it for the signal for our radiator fans, the signal for our ECU, and the signal for our fuel system. What we also added now is a second connector that has the, I guess you'd say the sensor signals for the air-fuel ratio, which is going to have to go up to the dashboard, the tachometer reading, which is going to have to go up to the dashboard, and we have the oil pressure, which is also surprisingly going to go up to the dashboard. In addition to that, we also included our injector power line, which is basically going to go, it's a shared splice that we have between the line going to the fuel pump and the injectors. They're both working off of the same relay. We basically just branched it out, so when it gets the signal from the fuel injector, when it gets the fuel signal from the ECU, both our fuel injectors and our fuel pump will turn on because of the relay. So now what we have to do, and again, I apologize if that's complicated, but actually we're making really good progress. So really all we have left to do is run our wires that we need to up to the dash into the the radiator fans, which we've actually already run the radiator fan wires back, and I'm pretty sure in the past I already ran the wires for the tachometer and the oil pressure gauge. Originally, when this was air cooled, I didn't have an air fuel ratio sensor, so that line will probably need to be created, but I basically left these lines along from the original harness, pulled them out from the sheathing, and we'll run them in the opposite direction. I'm most likely going to add another group of connectors, just again so that we don't get tied down. We don't have we don't have a permanent connection between things at the relay board all the way up in the dash, because it makes it really difficult to pull the dash, pull the relay board, and all those things. So we may add one or two connectors along the way, but probably the next update I'll give you guys is when we have everything complete for the lines running to the dashboard, and from there it'll just be all the powers and grounds that need to go to the battery. So yeah, we're getting really close. Alright, so another big part of this install is actually reworking our gauge cluster. So what you can see here is, this is actually a project I had a long time ago, like my first one on the Beetle. Let's get it into focus, make it look nice. Let's see. Yeah, so this is my first project on the Beetle because the wiring was terrible in it when I bought it, and to be frank, this isn't a huge improvement, but at least I know what every wire is doing. But so you see, I already removed, we had a switch for the fuel pump and for the ignition coil. This is all just kind of like giving it kind of like an airplane thing with all our toggle switches. So what I need to do is for our new AFR gauge, bang, our new AFR gauge, we need to splice into the 12-volt switch, the lighting power, and the ground, and we're going to have an actual signal go back to our ECU via our AFR input. So what we're going to have to do is splice these into the current gauge wiring that I have, and additionally we're going to kind of retrofit another part of our 12-volt switch to go back to our relay board so that we have it for our fuel system and for our ECU. And then in addition to all that, we're going to take our wires that we already have here for the oil pressure and the tachometer, and we're going to make sure that those run correctly back to our ECU. Alright, so another quick update. Although this looks like a mess of wires, there's actually just a lot of stuff on the table, but we do have the 4-pin connector added for our air fuel ratios gauge, our oil pressure gauge, our tachometer, and our 12-volt switch, all of which have to run back to either the ECU or the relay board. So what I also did was I started to run the 4 wires, the 4 new wires for that connector that we need, and I was fortunate that I could actually fit it in the same sheathing that we used to run the fuel pump and the radiator fan wires, and we're just going to break it out at the dash and bring it across. So now the wire is actually hidden underneath here. I'll kind of show you briefly. See, it's hidden underneath here and goes all the way back to here, which is where we will be putting our relay panel and our ECU, somewhere in here once we clean it out and maybe make a mount for it. Alright, so that's where we're going to call the video for today. Pretty much everything left at this point is very trivial. We really just need to add any pins for wires that we've identified and connectorize them to complete the whole wiring system. So what we really have left to do is just, like I said, connect that dashboard, connect that wiring at the dashboard all the way back to the relay panel and the ECU. And then we just need to pin out the wires for the ECU to the engine harness. Other than all of that, to actually run the car, we just need to add our powers and grounds, which will be part of the wiring, finishing up the wiring of the relay board. We need to add vacuum lines, and then we need to flash a tune on the computer. So in our next video, we'll show you very minimal of what was left for the wiring. We don't want to, really bog down all our content with wiring. We'll show you how we flash the tune onto the ECU. We'll start with a base map. Hopefully we can find something that Megasquirt, DIY Auto-Tune, or someone has provided to kind of work off of. But I know that there's also a feature in the ECU where you kind of set up the parameters of your engine and it gives you a really rough estimate, which should be enough for us to get our first start. And then we'll also just check any of the fuel and oil lines to make sure that we're not going to have any leaks, and add our vacuum lines, and then we will have a running motor. Of course, we still need to add coolant lines, which we'll be doing later, as well as just kind of tidying up everything that we've touched up to this point. So as always, we really appreciate you guys viewing. If you haven't hit subscribe, be sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed what you saw, leave a comment below. In particular, we'd like to know what you guys thought of the shirt I showed earlier in the video, and if you guys would be interested in purchasing some merchandise. And additionally, we want to know what you guys think we should name the car. And actually, as I was doing all this, I realized, we can look over here, I need some suggestions for front seats because we currently do not have any. So let me know what you guys think about that as well. I'd like to keep something kind of classic looking, but also a little bit more sporty, maybe with some bolstering. So please leave some comments below. We read all of them. We really we try to respond to all the ones, at least the ones that aren't all the ones that are worthy of response. And other than that, thank you for joining in. Hope to see you again soon.